The Anne of Green Gables Storybook, based on the Kevin Sullivan film of Lucy Maud Montgomery's classic novel. Screenplay by Kevin Sullivan and Joe Weisenfeld. Storybook adapted by Fiona McHugh. Copyright 1987, Anne of Green Gables Productions. Anne recited the lines slowly. The words hovered like bubbles in the bright air. Willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver. It was a clear November morning in Marysville, Nova Scotia, and Anne Shirley was on her way back to the Hammond homestead with enough eggs and milk to feed the 8 Hammond children. Keeping her eyes on her book, she shifted the basket of eggs to her other arm and struggled on up the hill. The full pail of milk banged against her side as she walked. A small white wave splashed over the rim and seeped down her skirt, but she paid no attention. In her imagination, she was no longer a skinny red-haired orphan, but the mysterious and beautiful Lady of Shalott. Tennyson's words had a magical ring. She spoke them aloud like a spell. There she weaves by night and day, a magic web with colors gay. She has heard a whisper say, a curse is on her if she stay to look down to Camelot. A grating call carried up from the other side of the hill, shattering the dream. Anne Shirley! Anne Shirley! Get down here this minute! These twins need changin'. You're late with the eggs and milk, and Mr. Hammond's been waiting a good hour for you to bring him his lunch. The Lady of Shalott vanished, and plain Anne Shirley came down to earth with a bump. She was 13. She worked for nagging Mrs. Hammond, and she was behind with her chores. By the time Anne arrived back at the cabin, Mrs. Hammond had worked herself into a fury. Dumping one of her damp babies into Anne's arms, she seized the precious book of poetry and flung it into the fire. I'll thank you to look after my babies instead of poring over them fool books of yours, she snapped. I do enjoy babies in moderation, Mrs. Hammond, replied Anne, fighting back tears. But twins 3 times in succession is too much. Besides, she added, trying not to watch as the Lady of Shalott went up in flames, I simply couldn't live here if I didn't have any imagination. Mrs. Hammond's eyes narrowed. I'll take none of your cheek, Anne Shirley. One more word and it's back to the orphanage with you. Now get those babies changed before you take Mr. Hammond his lunch. And be quick about it, or he'll give you a whipping you won't forget. Anne meant to hurry with Mr. Hammond's lunch, but she couldn't help noticing how the birches in the woods shone as golden as the sun. Then, too, there were heaps of leaves in the hollows, and they rustled underfoot with such a satisfying sound. They reminded her of poetry. She tried to keep from thinking about the Lady of Shalott, but it was hard not to mourn her. I just love poetry that gives you that crinkly feeling up and down your back, she confided to a crimson maple. As soon as she reached the mill, all thoughts of ladies and poems were driven from Anne's mind, for Mr. Hammond had suffered a heart attack. In a fit of anger, he had run toward one of his employees, intending to strike him, but his own heart had struck the first blow. There he lay, stretched out and still, the last victim of his legendary bad temper. Late that night, after she had put the children to bed, Anne spoke into the darkened mirror. Katie, she whispered, if only I hadn't lost myself in the beauty of the day, the one beauty which has allowed me. Perhaps Mr. Hammond might still be with us. But even Katie, her imaginary friend, was silent. Indeed, the shock of Mr. Hammond's death seemed to blanket the whole house in silence. The only sound was an occasional sniff from the grieving Mrs. Hammond and the murmurings of her cousin Essie, who had come to help with the funeral. Tiptoeing downstairs, Anne was arrested in mid-step by a sudden comment from Essie. "That home girl," she said, and though her voice was quiet, it cut through Anne like a blade. "She'll have to go back where she came from." Anne crept down the rest of the stairs and into the kitchen. Mrs. Hammond sat at the table, staring bleakly into space. Essie stood behind her. "Mrs. Hammond?" faltered Anne. "Mrs. Hammond, I blame myself entirely for poor Mr. Hammond's death. To have to wait an extra hour for lunch is a terrible burden to place on any man. I shall never overcome my grief. But please, please don't send me back to the orphanage." Mrs. Hammond's eyes seemed to look right through Anne. "Orphan children are all the same," announced Essie to no one in particular. "Trash, that's what they are." Mrs. Hammond nodded. Her eyes slowly focused on Anne. They were cold and empty. "Trash," she repeated dully. "That's right, Anne Shirley. I was daft when I took you in. I'd be daft to keep you." Anne backed out of the room, closing the door behind her. She stood alone in the shadowy hall, frightened by her own future. It was the end of another long, uneventful day at the Fairview Orphanage in Hopetown. Amidst the flurry of bedtime preparations, no one seemed to notice a still figure pressed against the window pane. 6 months had passed since Mrs. Hammond returned a weeping Anne to the orphanage. During those 6 months, the only comfort the lonely child could find had lain in her imaginary world. "Katie," she whispered now, "I'm truly glad we have each other. It's so difficult finding a kindred spirit these days." As she spoke, a tall figure entered the darkened dormitory. It was the director of the orphanage, Mrs. Cadbury. "Anne Shirley," she chided gently, "I might have known I'd find you here in the window seat instead of in your bed like everyone else." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cadbury," said Anne. "I don't mean to be difficult. Truly, I don't. It's just that my life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes." "Well then, perhaps my news may resurrect some of them," said Mrs. Cadbury, with a trace of a smile. "We've had a request for 2 of our girls to live with families in Prince Edward Island, and I intend that you shall be one of them." The child's eyes glowed. "A family for me? Oh, thank you, Mrs. Cadbury. Thank you with all my heart." Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow. It was a perfect setting for someone who was known throughout the length and breadth of Avonlea for her awesome ability to manage other people's concerns almost as well as her own. One afternoon in early June, she was sitting in her usual position on the front porch when her sharp eye spotted something that almost made her drop her knitting. Could it be? Why, yes, it was. It was Matthew Cuthbert driving that horse and buggy, and he was dressed in his best suit. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? "I declare, I'm clean puzzled," she muttered, standing up to get a better look. "He's not going fast enough for the doctor. He's wearing a suit, so he can't be going for turnip seed. Oh, my afternoon is ruined. I won't have a moment's peace until I know what that man is up to. Marilla is simply going to have to explain all of this." Pausing only to skewer her hat to her head, she set out for Green Gables, the rambling green and white house where Marilla Cuthbert lived with her brother, Matthew. As Mrs. Rachel stepped into Marilla's spotless kitchen, she noticed that the table was laid for 3. Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea. But who could it possibly be? Mrs. Rachel was dizzy with puzzlement. "I was kind of worried about you, Marilla, when I saw your brother drive by just now, in his suit." Marilla looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was. But there was a saving something about her mouth that, if it had been developed, might have hinted at a sense of humor. This afternoon her stern face held no clue to the mystery. Her whole attention seemed concentrated on the silver she was cleaning. "I'm fine, just fine, thank you, Rachel," she answered calmly. Mrs. Rachel tapped her toes. Her elbows jerked with impatience. "Matthew never goes to town this time of year, Marilla." Marilla's tone gave nothing away. "Matthew wasn't going to town," she said evenly. "Oh, don't keep me in such suspense, for heaven's sake," implored Mrs. Rachel. The tight lines around Marilla's mouth relented into a tiny smile. "He was going to Bright River," she explained. "We're getting a little boy from the orphanage at Hopetown. Matthew's gone to fetch him from the station." If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. "Why, Marilla!" she exclaimed, when her voice finally returned to her. "A boy! Why, you don't know the first thing about raising children. Whatever put such an idea into your head?" "Well, Matthew's getting along in years. He's not as spry as he once was, and his heart bothers him a good deal. Mrs. Spencer was up here a while back, and she said she was getting a girl from Hopetown Asylum in the spring. Matthew and I thought it over, and we decided to send word by Mrs. Spencer's niece, Roberta, to tell her to bring us home a boy while she was at it." It was unavoidably clear to Mrs. Rachel that all this planning had taken place without benefit of her advice. Yet Marilla was calmly making tea and talking as if boys were fetched from asylums every day of the week. "We told her to fix us up with a little boy of 11 or 12, she was saying. "Old enough to do the chores and young enough to be brought up properly." It was all too much for Mrs. Rachel. "Now look here," she burst out. "You know I pride myself on always speaking my mind. I'll just tell you plain that I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I could have told you that what you're planning is risky. Why, just last week I read in the paper how a couple took a boy out of an orphan asylum and he set fire to their house at night. On purpose. Burnt them to a crisp in their beds. Well, I won't say that I haven't had my qualms, Rachel. But Matthew was real determined," replied Marilla. "And it's so seldom he sets his mind on anything that I felt I had to give in." "And there was another case 6 months ago over in New Brunswick," broke in Mrs. Rachel eagerly, warming to her theme, "where an asylum child put strychnine in the well. The entire family died in agony. Only it was a girl in that instance." "Well," said Marilla firmly, "we are not getting a girl." When Matthew Cuthbert reached Bright River Station, there was no sign of any train. He tied his horse in the yard and went to find the station master. "Is the afternoon train due soon, Angus?" he inquired. "Been and gone a half hour ago, Matthew," replied the station master. "There was a passenger dropped off for you. She's waiting out there on the platform. I told her she could wait in the ladies' waiting room, but she said there was more scope for her imagination outside." "She?" echoed Matthew hoarsely. "But it's a boy I came for." "Well, I dare say she can explain it all," said the station master, chuckling. "That one has a tongue of her own." Matthew Cuthbert's shyness was legendary. He dreaded all women except his sister Marilla. His first instinct was to get back in the buggy and drive away as fast as he could. But instead he groaned inwardly and peered cautiously around the edge of the building. There was no boy in sight, only a thin, red-headed girl clutching a shabby carpet-bag. Matthew gulped. She was gazing straight at him. She was bounding toward him. In a second, Matthew was staring down into a face that was small, white and thin. It was also much freckled. The eyes that smiled up at him looked sometimes green, sometimes gray. "I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables?" she said, in a voice that was peculiarly clear and sweet. "I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming for me tonight. I had made up my mind to climb up that big wild cherry tree and wait for you there till morning. It would be lovely to sleep in a cherry tree, all white with bloom in the moonshine, don't you think?" "Oh, yes, it would. No, it wouldn't. Said Matthew in agony. "There's been a big mistake." "Oh, no, there's no mistake," the mysterious creature assured him earnestly. "Not if you're Mr. Matthew Cuthbert. Mrs. Spencer told me to wait right here for you, and so I've done. Most pleasantly, I must say. This is beautiful country you have here, Mr. Cuthbert." She was holding out her hand to him. Matthew took it awkwardly in his. There and then he decided what to do. He could not tell this child with the glowing eyes that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla do that. "I'm sorry I was late," he said shyly. "Come along. The horse is in the yard." Once in the buggy, the child could barely contain her delight. "Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you," she burst out. "I've never belonged to anybody before, and the asylum was the worst place I've lived in yet. I don't suppose you were ever an orphan in an asylum, so you can't possibly understand what it's like. It's worse than anything you can imagine. Mrs. Spencer says it's wicked of me to talk like that. But I don't mean to be wicked. It's just so easy to be wicked without knowing it, isn't it?" Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself in the company of this freckled witch. He thought that he kind of liked her chatter. "Why, look," she was saying. "There are some more cherry trees in bloom. This island is the bloomiest place. I just love it already. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest spot in Canada, and I used to dream I was living here. This is the first dream that's ever come true for me." She looked over at Matthew. Just now I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't feel exactly perfectly happy because, well, what color would you call this?" She twitched one of her long, glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. Matthew was not used to deciding on the tints of ladies' tresses, but in this case there couldn't be much doubt. "It's red, ain't it?" The girl's sigh seemed to come from her very toes. "Yes, it's red," she said sadly. "Now you see why I can't be perfectly happy. I know I'm skinny and a little freckled and my eyes are green, but I can imagine I have a beautiful rose-petal complexion and lovely starry violet eyes. But I cannot imagine my red hair away. It will be my lifelong sorrow. Have you ever imagined what it must feel like to be divinely beautiful?" Matthew swallowed. "Well, now, no, I haven't," he confessed. "I have often. Which would you rather be, divinely beautiful, or dazzlingly clever, or angelically good?" Matthew was beginning to feel as he had once felt in his youth, when another boy had coaxed him onto the merry-go-round at a picnic. "Well, now, I don't know exactly. Neither do I. I know I'll never be angelically good. Mrs. Spencer says I talk too much and— Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert!" That was not what Mrs. Spencer had said, nor had Matthew done anything astonishing. They had simply rounded a curve and found themselves in a stretch of road completely arched over with huge, wide-spreading apple trees. Overhead was one long canopy of snowy, fragrant bloom. Below the boughs, the air was full of a purple twilight. Its beauty seemed to strike the child dumb. She leaned back in the buggy, Her face lifted rapturously to the white splendor above. Matthew glanced over at her. Pretty, ain't it? Folks call it the Avenue. Pretty doesn't seem the right word to use, nor beautiful either. It's the first thing I ever saw that couldn't be improved on by imagination. It gave me a queer, funny ache, and yet it was a pleasant ache. Did you ever have an ache like that, Mr. Cuthbert? Well, now, I just can't recollect that I ever had. I have it whenever I see anything royally beautiful. But they shouldn't call this place the Avenue. They should call it, she paused, the White Way of Delight. They turned out of the avenue and drove over the crest of a hill. Below them was a pond, its water a glory of many shifting hues. On a slope beyond, a little gray house peered around a white apple orchard. That's Barry's Pond, said Matthew. I shall call it the Lake of Shining Waters. I know that's the right name for it, because whenever I hit on a name that suits exactly, it gives me a thrill. Do things ever give you a thrill, Mr. Cuthbert? Matthew ruminated. Well, now, yes. Digging up them ugly white grubs in the cucumber beds. Anne smiled and tucked her arm inside his. They had reached the crest of a hill. To the west, a dark church spire rose up against a marigold sky. Below was a little valley where, far back from the road, stood a farmstead, dimly white with blossoming trees in the twilight of the surrounding woods. There, said Matthew, pointing proudly. Yonder's Green Gables. Anne gazed at it rapturously. Just as soon as I saw it, I felt it was home. Oh, it seems as if I must be in a dream. I've pinched myself so many times today to make sure that this all was real. But it is real, and we're nearly home. Marilla came briskly forward as Matthew entered the hall, but she stopped short when her eyes fell on the odd little figure clutching the faded carpet bag. Matthew Cuthbert, she demanded. Who is that? It's a girl, answered Matthew wretchedly. I can see that. Where's the boy? There weren't any, just her, replied Matthew, staring at the carpet. I figured we just couldn't leave her there, no matter what the mistake was. Well, said Marilla, almost speechless, this is a fine kettle of fish. This is what comes of sending word instead of going ourselves. All the animation faded from Anne's face. Suddenly she seemed to grasp the full meaning of what was being said. You don't want me? She cried. You don't want me because I'm not a boy? Nobody ever did want me. I might have known this was all too beautiful to be true. She burst into tears. Matthew and Marilla stared at each other over her bent head. Neither of them knew what to say or do. Finally, Marilla spoke. Come now, she said awkwardly. Don't cry so. It isn't your fault. Oh, sobbed the child, this is just the most tragical thing that ever happened to me. Something like a reluctant smile, rusty from long disuse, softened Marilla's grim expression. What's your name, child? She asked. Would you please call me Cordelia? Call you Cordelia? Is that your name? It's not exactly my name, but I would love to be called Cordelia. It's such a perfectly elegant name. What is your name, child? And no more nonsense. Anne Shirley, answered the owner of that name reluctantly. Plain old, unromantic Anne Shirley. Unromantic fiddlesticks, said the unsympathetic Marilla. Anne Shirley is a fine, sensible name, and hardly one to be ashamed of. Oh, I'm not ashamed of it, explained Anne. But if you must call me Anne, would you please be sure to spell it with an E? Anne with an E looks quite distinguished. So if you'll only call me Anne with an E, I shall try to reconcile myself to not being called Cordelia. Very well, then, Anne with an E, said Marilla in exasperation. How is it that you happen to be picked instead of a boy? If I were very beautiful and had nut-brown hair, would you keep me?" "No," said Marilla firmly. "We want a boy to help Matthew on the farm. A girl would be of no use to us. Now bring your bag and come along upstairs. We'll have to put you somewhere for the night." Later that evening, Marilla spoke her mind to Matthew. "I'm taking her over to that Spencer woman in the morning. She'll have to be sent back to the asylum." "I suppose," said Matthew reluctantly. "You suppose? Don't you know it?" "She's a real interesting little thing, Marilla. Seems a pity to send her back. She's so set on staying." Marilla's astonishment knew no bounds. "Matthew Cuthbert, I believe that child has bewitched you. I can see plain as plain you want to keep her." "We could hire a boy to help me," said Matthew, "and she'd be company for you." "I'm not suffering for company," replied Marilla shortly. "Particularly not for someone who prattles on without stopping for breath. She'll have to go straight back where she came from. What good would she be to us?" "We might be of some good to her," said Matthew suddenly and unexpectedly. After she had put her dishes away, Marilla went to bed, frowning most resolutely. And upstairs, in the east gable, a lonely, friendless child cried herself to sleep. The next morning, Matthew reluctantly hitched the sorrel mare into the buggy and helped Marilla and Anne up. "Little Jerry Butte from the creek was around," he said to Marilla, "and I told him I guess I'd hire him for the summer." Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane at an alarming pace. Looking back once, Marilla saw her brother leaning over the gate, looking wistfully after them. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove. She and her daughter, Flora Jane, came running down the front steps as Marilla drove the buggy up to the door. Surprise and welcome mingled on Mrs. Spencer's kindly face. "Why, Marilla," she exclaimed, "you're the last person I expected to see today. I imagined you'd be getting Anne settled. And how are you, Anne?" A blight seemed to have descended on Anne. "I'm as well as a victim of tragic circumstances could be, thank you," she replied tonelessly. "The fact is, there's been some queer mistakes, Sarah," explained Marilla. "We told Roberta for you to get us a boy." "Marilla Cuthbert, you don't say so!" gasped Mrs. Spencer. "Why, Roberta distinctly said you wanted a girl." "I suppose the asylum will take the child back?" asked Marilla. "Well, as a matter of fact, Mrs. Blewett was up here yesterday, asking me if I could get her a little girl. She has 10 children, you know, and another on the way. Anne would be just the kind of help she needs." "Excuse me, Mrs. Spencer," interrupted Anne in mortal dread. "But would there happen to be any twins among them?" "Why, she has 2 sets of twins," replied Mrs. Spencer. "How did you know, child?" "Twins seem to be my lot in life," said Anne mournfully. Just then a shrill voice hailed Mrs. Spencer, and she turned in astonishment. "I declare, if that isn't Mrs. Blewett coming up the lane this blessed minute!" she exclaimed. "Why, I call this positively providential." Mrs. Blewett was a shrewish-faced woman, without an ounce of spare flesh on her bones. She greeted the group coldly. "Mrs. Blewett, this is Anne Shirley," beamed Mrs. Spencer. "I think she'll be just the thing for you." Mrs. Blewett's sharp eyes darted over Anne from head to foot. "How old are you, girl?" she demanded. 13, whispered Anne. Sniffed Mrs. Blewett. "Ain't much to you. But you're wiry, and I don't know but the wiry ones can work the hardest. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and I want you to act smart and be respectful." She turned toward Marilla. "I'll take her off your hands this minute, Miss Cuthbert," she announced virtuously. "My twins are awful fractious these days, and I'm clean worn out." But Marilla had been watching Anne. She had seen in the pale face such a look of misery that she felt moved to help. Well, now, I don't know, she said slowly. Perhaps I oughtn't to make a decision until I speak to Matthew. I'll just take her home again and consult him. Good afternoon, ladies. With that, Marilla cracked the whip and the buggy moved off down the lane. A faint flush of hope crept up Anne's cheeks. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert," she whispered, as if speaking aloud might shatter the glorious possibility. "Did you really say it, or did I only just imagine it?" "I haven't said anything yet, young lady," retorted Marilla sharply. "Sending you back to the orphanage is one thing. Handing you over to the likes of Matilda Blewett is another. And if you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't, I think you'd better learn to control that imagination of yours." Anne folded her hands meekly. "I'll try to do anything and be anything you want, Miss Cuthbert," she said. "If only you'll keep me." When they returned to Green Gables, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla could read the relief in his face when he saw that she had at least brought Anne back with her. But she said nothing until later when she went out to the barn to talk things over with him. "I wouldn't give a dog I liked to that Blewett woman," she announced defensively. Matthew continued milking the cows. He remained silent. "It makes no sense to keep her," floundered Marilla. "No sense at all." Matthew made no reply. "But," continued Marilla, all in a rush, "but if we did keep her, I'd expect you not to interfere with my methods. An old maid like me may not know much about raising a child, but I know a darn sight more than an old bachelor like you." Matthew's face was a glow of delight, but he kept his eyes lowered and his mouth determinedly closed. "I'll say one thing for her, though," said Marilla with a dry chuckle. "She can talk the hind leg off a mule. And won't that be a nice change around here?" When Anne came down to breakfast the next morning, she confronted Marilla with the air of one determined to know the worst. "Oh, please, Miss Cuthbert," she implored. "Tell me if you're going to send me back. I just can't bear not knowing any longer." "Well, you'll just have to bear it," said Marilla, "because I simply don't know. I thought maybe we'd put it on trial for a while, for all of our sakes. Would that suit you?" "If you think it's necessary, Miss Cuthbert," replied Anne, sitting down at the table. "One thing I will insist on, though," continued Marilla, "is that while you're under my roof you will say your prayers. So here." She thrust an illustrated card under Anne's nose. "Learn that while you're eating your breakfast." "Our Father, who art in heaven," read Anne aloud. "Hallowed be thy name." "Why, Miss Cuthbert," she broke off delightedly, "it's just like a line of music. I'm so glad you thought of making me learn this." "Well, learn it then, and hold your tongue," said Marilla in exasperation. She had just spied Rachel Lynde bustling up the garden path, and was not sure she felt capable of coping with that lady's inspection of Anne. "Can't you send her back, Marilla?" was the question uttered by Mrs. Rachel almost as soon as she had crossed the threshold. For she had been one of the first in Avonlea to hear about what she termed Marilla's mistake. We're still considering on it," replied Marilla uncertainly. "Considering? What is there to consider?" demanded Mrs. Rachel. "Lawful heart," she continued, as Anne stood up to be introduced. "Her looks are certainly nothing to consider. Did anyone ever see such freckles? She's terribly skinny and homely, Marilla, and her hair is as red as carrots." With one bound, Anne crossed the kitchen floor and stood before Mrs. Rachel. Her lips quivered. Her face was scarlet with anger. "How dare you!" she cried in a voice choked with rage. "How dare you call me skinny and ugly? How dare you call me freckled and red-headed? You're a rude, unfeeling woman, and I'll never forgive you. Never! Never!" "Anne Shirley!" exclaimed Marilla. But Anne, head up, eyes blazing, continued to face Mrs. Lynde. "How would you like to have nasty things said about you?" she stormed. "How would you like to be told that you're fat and ugly and a sour old gossip and probably hadn't a spark of imagination in you?" "Anne!" called Marilla sharply. But it was too late. Anne had rushed from the house, slamming the door behind her. "You mark my words, Marilla," declared Mrs. Rachel darkly. "That's the kind puts strychnine in the well." Clutching her tattered dignity, she swept toward the door. "Goodbye, Marilla. Come down and see me when you can, but don't expect me to visit here ever again if I'm to be treated in such a fashion." And with an air of offended majesty, Mrs. Rachel waddled from the house. Marilla found Anne in the garden, face down on a bench, sobbing her heart out. "Anne Shirley," she said angrily, "when I said trial, I never thought you'd take me literally. You had no right to speak to Mrs. Lynde in that way." "She had no right to say what she did," wailed Anne, her face swollen and tear-stained. Alarmed by the slamming of doors and the abrupt departure of Mrs. Rachel, Matthew had approached the house from the vegetable patch, where he had been working. Now, seeing Marilla in close discussion with a weeping Anne, he paused. Unwilling to interfere, he was too unsettled by Anne's evident distress to return to work. "Rachel deserves an apology, and you will go to her and give it," he heard Marilla declare firmly. "Oh, Miss Cuthbert," sobbed Anne, "I can never do that. You can shut me up in a dark, damp dungeon inhabited by snakes and toads and feed me on only bread and water, and I won't complain. But I cannot ask Mrs. Lynde to forgive me." "We're not in the habit of shutting people up in dark, damp dungeons," said Marilla dryly, "especially as they're rather scarce in Avonlea. But apologize to Mrs. Lynde you must and shall." "How can I tell Mrs. Lynde I'm sorry when I'm not? I'm sorry I vexed you, but I'm glad I said those things to her. I can't even imagine I'm sorry." "If you expect to remain under my roof," said Marilla, and her tone was final, "you will apologize to Mrs. Lynde." Matthew watched uncomfortably as Anne straightened her shoulders and looked straight into Marilla's eyes. "Then you'll have to send me back," she said quietly. Marilla rose to her feet. She felt very old all of a sudden. "Very well then, Anne. Go to your room." Matthew waited until Marilla went out that evening to bring the cows from the back pasture. Then, with the air of a burglar, he slipped into the house and crept upstairs. Anne was sitting by the window. Her carpet bag waited at her feet. "Ain't been upstairs in this house in 4 years," said Matthew shyly. Anne's red eyes and tear-stained face touched his heart. "I guess you're leaving then," he said sadly. "Oh, Matthew, I'd rather die than apologize to Mrs. Lynde." Matthew shifted uneasily. "Well now, Marilla's a dreadful determined woman. Dreadful determined. You don't have to be exactly sorry, you know. You can be sort of sorry." "But I'm not sorry at all," objected Anne. "I hear Mrs. Blewett's an awful workhorse. Besides, Anne, it'd be awful lonesome around here without you. Couldn't you just smooth it over?" Anne studied Matthew's face. "You mean," she said slowly, "you mean you really don't want me to go?" Matthew shook his head. This discovery seemed to inspire Anne. "Why, Matthew, I'd do anything for you. If you really don't want me to go, why then it certainly wouldn't be right to let Mrs. Lynde be the cause of our parting. I don't, as you say, have to be exactly sorry. I just have to remove the disgrace I've brought to Marilla's good name." That's right, Anne," said Matthew eagerly. "Just smooth it over, so to speak. That's what I was trying to get at." He patted her head gently. "Don't tell Marilla I said anything, will you? She'll say I'm interfering." "Wild horses couldn't drag it from me," promised Anne solemnly. Smiling, Matthew tiptoed from the room, a little frightened by his own success. Upon her return to the house, Marilla was agreeably surprised to see a penitent Anne enter the kitchen. "I'm sorry I lost my temper and said those rude things, Miss Cuthbert," she said meekly, "and I'm willing to go and tell Mrs. Lynde so." "Very well." Marilla's crispness gave no sign of her relief. She had spent the last few hours agonizing over what she would do if Anne did not give in. "I'll take you over first thing. Now get up to bed and don't forget to say your prayers." After Anne had skipped off to bed, Marilla turned to her brother. "I knew she'd come to her senses if we left her alone," she said loftily. Matthew merely nodded and continued drinking his tea. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was sitting in her usual observation post on the front porch when Marilla arrived with Anne in tow the next morning. Before a word could be spoken, Anne fell to her knees in front of the astonished Rachel. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry," she said with a quiver in her voice. "I have disgraced my good friends who have let me stay at Green Gables even though I am not a boy. What you said was true. I am skinny and ugly, and my hair is red. What I said about you was true too, only I shouldn't have said it. Please, Mrs. Lynde, please forgive me. You wouldn't be so cruel as to inflict a lifelong sorrow on a poor orphan, would you? Please say you forgive me." All resentment vanished from Mrs. Lynde's kindly, if officious, heart. There, child," she said warmly. "Of course I forgive you. You mustn't mind me. I'm known throughout these parts as a woman who speaks her mind. And don't worry about your hair. I knew a girl once who had hair every bit as red as yours, but when she grew up, it darkened into a real handsome auburn." Anne drew a deep breath as she rose to her feet. "You have given me hope, Mrs. Lynde," she said. "I shall always think of you as a benefactor." "Laws, Marilla," said Rachel, strangely satisfied. "All this child needs is discipline and a proper education. The Sunday school picnic's scheduled this week for Barry's Field. I want you to take Anne so she can meet some civilized children her own age. And trial or no trial, you ought to put her in school." As Marilla and Anne walked home from Rachel's, Marilla brought up the subject of school once more. "Putting you in school doesn't mean I've come to a decision, Anne. It's just as easy to take you out as put you in." "It does give a person room to hope, though, Miss Cuthbert. Besides, my temper will never get the better of me again, I promise." "I hope not," said Marilla fervently. "Good behavior, in the first place, is more important than theatrical apologies afterward. I thought since I had to do it, I might as well do it thoroughly. Save your thoroughness for prayer, Anne. God does not want a fair-weather friend." "The only real friend I ever had was Katie Maurice," said Anne mournfully. "And she was really just my window friend." "Window friend?" "I discovered her in the window of Mrs. Thomas's bookcase. It was the only window which hadn't been smashed by her intoxicated husband. I lived with the Thomases before I lived with the Hammonds. I used to wish I knew the spell to step through the glass into Katie's world, which was so beautiful." "Well, I don't think you should have window friends any more, Anne," said Marilla shortly. For a while they walked on in silence. Then Anne spoke again. "Do you think I shall ever have a bosom friend, Miss Cuthbert?" she asked. A what kind of friend?" "A bosom friend, a really kindred spirit. I've dreamt of meeting her all my life." "Diana Barry lives over there on Orchard Slope," Marilla pointed. "She's about your age. Her parents are sponsoring the picnic next Sunday. You can meet her then." "Diana," murmured Anne dreamily. "Diana of the Lake of Shining Waters. For mercy's sake, child, you set your heart too much on silly names." "What should I call you, Miss Cuthbert?" asked Anne. "May I call you Aunt Marilla?" "You can call me just plain Marilla," said Marilla sternly. "I don't believe in calling people names that are not their own." "Couldn't you imagine that you were my aunt?" "No, I could not." "Don't you ever imagine things differently from what they are?" "No, I do not." "Oh, Marilla," sighed Anne, slipping her hand into the older woman's hard palm. "How much you miss!" Something warm and pleasant welled up in Marilla's heart at the touch of that thin little hand in hers. Perhaps it was a throb of the maternity she had missed, but it caused a glow of happiness that surprised her. From then on, Anne thought picnic and talked picnic and dreamed picnic. But several days before the charmed event was to take place, Marilla came downstairs with a troubled face. "Anne," she said, "have you touched my amethyst brooch? I thought I stuck it in my pincushion when I came home from church, but I can't find it anywhere." I did touch it," admitted Anne. "It's such a perfectly elegant brooch. I pinned it on yesterday, just for a minute. Amethysts are my idea of what diamonds should look like, Marilla. I think those lovely purple stones must be the souls of good violets, don't you?" But Marilla was in no mood for fanciful speculation. "You had no right to meddle with my things, Anne. That brooch isn't anywhere on the bureau. You can't have put it back." "I did put it back," said Anne quickly. Pertly, Marilla thought. "I just don't remember whether I stuck it on the pincushion or laid it in the china tray, but I'm perfectly certain I put it back." "I'll go and have another look," said Marilla, determined to be just. "If you put that brooch back, it's there still. If it isn't, I'll know you didn't." Marilla returned to her room and made a thorough search, not only over the bureau, but in every other place she thought the brooch might possibly be. It was not to be found. "Anne," she said, re-entering the kitchen, "the brooch is gone. By your own admission, you were the last person to handle it. Now what have you done with it? Tell me the truth at once. Did you take it out and lose it?" "No, I didn't," said Anne, meeting Marilla's gaze squarely. "I never took the brooch out of your room, and that's the truth, if I was to be led to the block for it, although I'm not very certain what a block is. So there, Marilla." Anne's "so there" was only intended to emphasize what she had said, but Marilla took it as a display of defiance. "I believe you are telling me a falsehood, Anne," she said sharply. "Go to your room and stay there until you are ready to confess." "You will let me out for the picnic, won't you?" asked Anne as she obediently left the room. "I just have to go to the picnic, Marilla." "You're not going to the picnic or anywhere else until you tell me the truth." "But if I don't go to the picnic, how will I ever make a bosom friend? Or any friend at all? That brooch meant a great deal to me, Anne. More than any picnic. Now go to your room." The next few days were troubled ones for Marilla. She emptied out drawers. She combed through every crack and cranny, but still no brooch appeared. And still Anne, confined to her room, refused to admit she had taken it. "Now I realize I was right not to be too hasty about keeping her," said Marilla to Matthew. It was the Sunday of the picnic, and she was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "We can't keep a liar and a thief, and you know it, Matthew." Matthew was confounded and puzzled. He had to admit that everything pointed to Anne as being the one who had taken the brooch, but he could not quickly lose faith in her. When Marilla took Anne's breakfast up to her on a tray, she found the child sitting on the edge of the bed, looking pale and resolute. "I'm ready to confess, Marilla." Marilla put down the tray. She felt no sense of triumph. "Let me hear what you have to say then, Anne." Somehow Anne sounded as if she were repeating a lesson she had learned. "I took the brooch," she said, "because I was overcome by an irresistible temptation. I was imagining I was Lady Cordelia Fitzgerald, and I just had to wear the brooch as I trod the footbridge over the lake of shining waters. I took the brooch off to admire how it shone in the sunlight, and then, as I leaned over the bridge, to gaze at my reflection in the lake, with the wind blowing my auburn hair, the brooch slipped from my fingers and sank, all purply sparkling, beneath the rippling waves. And that's the best I can do at confessing. May I go to the picnic now?" Marilla felt hot anger surge up in her heart. This child had taken and lost her treasured brooch, and now sat there calmly reciting details, without the least show of repentance. "You'll go to no picnic, Anne Shirley. You can pack your bags and start imagining life with Mrs. Blewett." And so saying, Marilla slammed the door and stormed down the stairs to get ready for church. Rachel Lynde was right, she fumed to the waiting Matthew as she threw her shawl over her shoulders. I should never have let that child worm her way into my affections. Marilla! Matthew's doleful expression transformed into one of delight. Oh, Marilla, look! Something was caught in the strands of shawl, something that glittered and sparkled in facets of violet light. Marilla snatched at it with a gasp. It was the amethyst brooch. Dear life and heart, said Marilla blankly. How can it be? Here's my brooch, safe and sound, that I thought was at the bottom of Barry's pond. Brooch in hand, she rushed up the stairs and into Anne's room. Whatever made you say you took it and lost it? She demanded, holding out the brooch. You said you'd keep me in my room till I confessed, returned Anne wearily. I simply had to go to the picnic, and so I thought out a confession last night in bed and made it as interesting as I could. But it was still a lie, objected Marilla. You wouldn't believe the truth, said Anne simply. Marilla's conscience pricked her. Anne, you do beat all. But I was wrong. I see that now. I shouldn't have doubted your word when I've never known you to tell a lie. Of course, it wasn't right to confess to a thing you hadn't done, but I drove you to it. She stretched out her hand to the child. So if you'll forgive me, Anne, I'll forgive you, and we'll start square again. Now get dressed for the service, and this afternoon we'll go to the picnic together. That afternoon shone forever in Anne's memory with a golden light. She tasted ice cream for the first time in her entire life, an experience she could only describe in one word, sublime. But best of all, she met her longed-for bosom friend at last. Diana Barry was pretty enough to satisfy even Anne's beauty-starved heart. Her hair was thick and raven dark. Her cheeks were rosy, and her black eyes danced with merriment. She reads entirely too much, her mother complained to Marilla, as the two girls eyed each other shyly. And I can't prevent her, for her father aids and abets her. I'm glad she has the prospect of a playmate. Perhaps it'll take her out of doors more. Diana and Anne wandered down to the river in bashful silence. When Anne finally spoke, it was almost in a whisper. Diana, she asked timidly, do you think you can like me enough to be my bosom friend? Diana laughed. Diana always laughed before she spoke. Why, I guess so, she said frankly. I'm awfully glad you've come to live at Green Gables, Anne. There isn't any other girl who lives near enough to play with, and I've no sisters big enough. Anne let out a huge sigh of relief. She could feel happiness pouring into her heart. Come on, she urged, taking Diana's hand. We don't want to miss the races. Later on, tired out from running and chattering and laughing, they sat contentedly together by the water's edge and watched the boats gliding by. There's Mr. Phillips, our teacher. Diana pointed at a young man who was gazing soulfully at his boating companion. You'll meet him when you start school. That's Prissy Andrews with him. He's helping her study for her entrance to Queen's. He's dead gone on her. Prissy's got a beautiful complexion, and he moons over her something terrible. Another boat floated by containing several giggling girls. One of them was leaning over the edge, trying to reach a water lily. That's Josie Pye, commented Diana scornfully. She's always looking for attention, especially from Gilbert Blythe. Following Diana's gaze, Anne's eyes came to rest on a tall boy with curly brown hair sitting nearby on the bank. Don't you think he's handsome? Asked Diana. Josie Pye certainly does. Just then, the boat full of giggling girls tipped slightly, and Josie fell into the water with a loud splash. I hope she nearly drowns, muttered Diana savagely. I wish it had been me, sighed Anne, carried away by the afternoon's excitement. It must be such a romantic experience to nearly drown. Diana burst out laughing. What a strange girl you are, Anne Shirley. All the same, I can tell we're going to get along really well." Anne's cup of happiness overflowed. Anne's first morning of school started off well. Mr. Phillips made a note of her name and then directed her to share a seat with Diana. It wasn't until Gilbert Blythe took it into his head to tease the new arrival that things began to go badly. Gilbert had been trying all morning, and failing utterly, to make Anne Shirley look at him. For Anne, with her chin propped on her hands and her eyes fixed on the blue glimpse of the lake of shining waters that the west window afforded, was far away in a dreamland of her own. Gilbert Blythe wasn't used to putting himself out to make a girl look at him and meeting with failure. She should look at him, that red-haired Shirley girl with the pointed chin and the big eyes that weren't like the eyes of any other girl in Avonlea school. Reaching across the aisle, he picked up the end of one of Anne's long braids, held it at arm's length, and hissed one word: "Carrots!" Then Anne looked at him with a vengeance. She did more than look. She sprang to her feet. "You mean, hateful boy!" she cried. "How dare you!" And then, crack! She had picked up her slate and smacked it down on Gilbert's head with such force that the slate broke clean in two. The whole class fell silent in horrified delight. In the sudden quiet, Mr. Phillips stalked down the aisle and laid his heavy hand on Anne's shoulder. "Anne Shirley, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Gilbert spoke up stoutly. "It was my fault, Mr. Phillips. I teased her." Mr. Phillips paid no attention to Gilbert. Marching Anne to the front of the class, he wrote on the blackboard for all to see, "Anne Shirley has a very bad temper." Then he read it out loud, so that even the primer class, who couldn't read, should understand. "You will write this out 100 times before leaving today," he thundered. With a white, set face, Anne obeyed. But before beginning, she stood on tiptoe and added an E to the ANN that Mr. Phillips had inscribed on the board. When school was dismissed, Anne marched out with her red head held high. Gilbert Blythe tried to intercept her at the porch door. "I'm awfully sorry I made fun of your hair, Anne," he whispered contritely. "Honest I am. Don't be mad at me for keeps now." Anne swept by disdainfully, without look or sign of hearing. "Oh, Anne, how could you?" breathed Diana as they walked down the lane together. Her tone was half reproachful, half admiring, for Diana felt that she could never have resisted Gilbert's plea. "Gilbert makes fun of all the girls," she said soothingly. "Why, he calls me Crowhead all the time, because my hair's so black, and I've never heard him apologize before either." "There's a world of difference between being called Crowhead and being called Carrots," retorted Anne. "I shall never forgive Gilbert Blythe. The iron has entered my soul, Diana. My mind is made up. My red hair is a curse." Just what Anne had meant when she had said her mind was made up was left for Marilla to discover a short while later. Having heard from Rachel Lynde about Anne's disastrous day at school, Marilla had rushed upstairs to confront her troublesome charge. She found the bedroom door locked. "Anne Shirley," she called, rapping as hard as she could. "I've heard all about it. Now you open this door at once." "Please go away, Marilla," came the muffled response. "I am in the depths of despair." "Despair fiddlesticks," grumped Marilla. "You open this door immediately." Marilla heard the bolt slide reluctantly open, but before she could enter the room, Anne had scuttled back to bed, throwing the covers over herself so that she was completely hidden from view. In one long stride, Marilla reached the bed and jerked back the covers. What she saw made her freeze with shock. "Anne Shirley," she gasped. "What have you done to your hair? Why, it's green." Green it most certainly was. A queer, dull, bronzy green, with streaks here and there of the original red to heighten the ghastly effect. Never in all her life had Marilla seen anything so grotesque as Anne's hair at that moment. "Oh, Marilla," wailed Anne, all crumpled up in the bed. "I thought nothing could be as bad as red hair. Green is 10 times worse. You little know how utterly wretched I am." "I little know how you got into this fix, but I demand that you tell me." "I dyed it," sobbed Anne. "He positively assured me it would turn a beautiful raven black." "Who did? Who are you talking about, child?" "The peddler we met on the road today. Oh, Marilla, what shall I do? I'll never be able to live this down. I can't face him again. That Gilbert Blythe had no right to call me carrots." Marilla sat down on the bed beside the sobbing child. "Did you really smash your slate over that boy's head?" she asked. If Anne had looked up, she might have seen a slight smile hovering in Marilla's eyes. But Anne was too submerged in her own sorrow to notice. "I'm afraid I did," she gulped. "Hard?" asked Marilla, and now the smile had definitely decided to stay. "Very hard, yes." Anne blew her nose. It was then that Marilla made up her mind. "I should be furious with you, Anne," she said softly. "Your first day at school. What a way to behave! But if you promise me that nothing of this sort will happen again, I won't say another word about it." "You mean you're not going to send me back?" asked Anne, unable to believe her ears. Marilla smiled. "I've come to a decision," she said. "The trial is over, Anne. You will stay at Green Gables." Anne sat bolt upright in bed, her green hair forgotten. She stared at Marilla as if trying to take in what she had said. "Stay at Green Gables," she repeated slowly. "Stay here with you and Matthew?" "Oh, Marilla!" She flung her arms around her. "Do you mean I can really belong to you now?" Marilla stood up, gently disengaging Anne's arms. "Something tells me you do belong here, child, after all," she said as she left the room. That evening, while Matthew drank his tea in the kitchen, Marilla skillfully cut Anne's hair. Wrapped in a sheet to protect her clothes, Anne surveyed the green curls lying at her feet. When Marilla had finished, Matthew shyly put his arm around Anne. "You're our girl now," he said proudly, "and the prettiest one this side of Halifax."